Hokie Hangover podcast. It's just Andrew and I for right now. Michael is on the way, I guess. Andrew, is that the
Only
best
time
way to
will
put it?
tell. Only time will tell on that one, Rick.
Yeah, that's a fair point. This is going to be a kind of a broader podcast, folks. I think obviously Virginia Tech played the Duke's Mayo Bowl on Friday. Things did not go particularly well for the Hokies, as I guess really most of us expected. Virginia Tech loses that game 24-10. First things first, though, uh, the pregame tailgate in the exact room that Andrew is recording from right now was phenomenal. Um,
The
Thank you,
room
buddy,
still
for
looks
having us.
like a tailgate was thrown here. Like, what does a man do with? I got I have so much excess beer that I can't keep it all in my fridge, or else I wouldn't have any room for anything else. So I mean, some
Just the
would say a
essentials,
good
man.
problem to have, but also after Duke's Mayo Bowl weekend. I have very little interest in drinking. Like,
Yeah.
we've knocked out a good amount of that, uh, you know, with the gang over the course of a couple days, really, depending on who we're talking about. But electric tailgate, good to see a lot of familiar faces here, and it's one of those things we could talk a little bit more about it at the end when/if Mike comes because he was here for it as well. But 6-6 game or 6-6 team game full of backups playing. Very clear, uh, vibe that was a game that, like you mentioned, we thought the Hokies were going to lose. And if you counted up the miles traveled just by the people that were in my living room, I think you could get us across the country. And that's saying something. So, win or lose, the cultural experience remains. It's always a good time. Uh, but, times could be better in terms of the actual on field product.
The nice part about this one, Andrew, at least I mean, it didn't really affect me anyway because I was in the press box, but there was no rain for this one. So y'all who that were in the stands were able to at least be dry. You were cold as hell, but you were at least dry.
Yeah, and again, the pre-game festivities did help with the cold. It wasn't as jarring as maybe it otherwise would have been. I know you went out on the field after the game, Ricky. I actually found one more picture from the disposable camera that I do need to send to you of you and Izzy out on the field. Nice picture there. But yeah, I mean, ultimately, the vibes in the stands were good for the scenario. And Virginia Tech, I mean, they didn't get they were evidently losing most of the game. They did take an early lead, uh,
Mhm.
which did give you some hope. But as we'll go through, it became pretty obvious early on that it wasn't going to be a totally sustainable success. Seemed unlikely. We'll call it that.
Yeah, I feel like the most successful things that happened during this game was number one, I got a jar of Duke's mayonnaise with Virginia Tech's logo on it
Hype.
for the Duke's Mayo Bowl. The other thing is that a friend of the show and loyal listener, Jimmy Cleveland, was out there bobbing for apples in Mayo.
No, he wasn't the one bobbing for apples and mayo. That would have been even more hilarious, but I don't think even Jimmy Cleveland would sign himself up for that. Maybe he would have. I don't know. They put a blindfold on him and they had 6 different flavors of mayo and they gave him
Ah,
4 taste tests and he had to guess which flavor it was. And he went
gotcha.
4 for 4. An impressive showing.
Yes.
I assume he didn't practice for it. I guess next time I'm at his apartment, I'll have to check the fridge for 6 different flavors of mayo. But no, he did a good job out there, and it was if there was anyone I didn't know was at the game, I learned it after James did that because people were blowing up my phone. They're like, "Oh my God, Andrew!" I'm like, "I know." And he did this voluntarily. He knew he was doing this before the game even happened. When if you have a event that's very public and slightly embarrassing, and you need someone to volunteer for it, look no further than Jimmy Cleveland, who did a great job. We're proud of you, Jim.
Absolutely. For those who didn't watch this game, essentially after the first quarter, this was a pretty big rout, right? Minnesota scored 3 touchdowns in the second quarter. And after that point, Andrew, I don't know what your thoughts were in terms of the game itself, but it didn't really seem like Tech was all that competitive, especially on offense after after the first quarter, quite honestly. Um, the passing game was not there. Pop Watson had like 81 pass yards in this game. Colin Schley didn't have much more. They did kind of a timeshare at quarterback, which we can get into later if you wish. But ultimately, it seemed like Virginia Tech's offense was incredibly overmatched, especially up front. They were completely unable to get a hat on a hat in the pass game. And then in the run game, it was essentially uphill sledding for the entirety of the contest. Um, was it as lopsided as it looked from the press box in the stands?
I would say it probably looked more lopsided in the press box, just given the lack of homerism that you were surrounded by, and maybe alcohol content in your blood. Uh, but yeah, I mean, it was again evident from the early offensive possessions that the stuff that and as I said all season long, right? Like to people who are like, Parker Clements is horrible, like blah blah blah, this, that, and the other. Which Parker Clements did play in the game, to be fair. He actually did not play very well if you look at the PFF stats. But like the guys who are on the starting offensive line are on the starting offensive line for a reason. Because the coaches feel like they're the best options out there. And you removed 3 of those 5 best options from a line that otherwise underperformed. And the results you got were, I mean, they were frankly, the results you got, right? I mean, Pop Watson, as I was telling people before the game, they're like, oh, like, what do you expect out of Pop? And I said, well, I don't expect very good offensive line play.
Mm-hmm.
And you have an already undersized quarterback without a ton of experience. And he's not going to have a serious run game to lean on. I just don't think that bodes well. And that's the result that we saw on the field, right? Like, so was it pretty good timing for like any offensive line commits from the transfer portal to come in? Yes. Because when you saw that, right? And, I'd have to do a deeper re-examination. And of course, like, I looked at the Pro Football Focus grades. Some guys did better than others. But the reality is that, like, it does not seem that starting 5 is going to be it. And that's not going to be the starting 5 that you want to roll out there. If you're Brent Pry going into, what ultimately will be a pretty decisive year for the head man. So some new blood, trying some new things out. Whether that makes it exponentially better or not, who knows? And whether a full off season and whether a new offensive line coach with a track record of good performances across the offensive line, whether that ultimately remains to be seen. But I think that what this game showed us is that those options are better than the alternative. We'll go with that.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I think we all kind of have to take this game with a grain of salt to an extent, right? I think there's obviously a difference between the roster that we saw on Friday and the roster we're going to see even in spring practices and certainly week 1 next year. There's going to be a night and day difference. With that said, a lot of the players that did play on Friday are going to be playing in pretty large roles next season. And the roles that they played in on Friday night are relatively close probably to what they're going to be asked to do next year. And it was a mixed bag for sure, up and down the roster on both sides of the ball. There were some guys where you felt like they certainly held their own. Dante Levitt was one that I felt like held his own in the past game. I didn't feel like he was picked on in this one. And he's certainly someone that's, I think a lot of us are expecting to be corner one next year, depending on how things shake out. But then you look at like a Brody Meadows or a Johnny Garrett on the offensive line. I wasn't really impressed with anyone on that unit. Receiver was a bit of a mixed bag, right? Aiden Green had a nice reception for uh, like 40 yards or something along those lines, but it was a coverage bust, so that it wasn't like he did a ton on that play. So there was some to like in this one. I thought the secondary itself as a unit really held up well in the second half. The defense in general, only giving up a few points in the second half was moderately impressive. But there were some folks that are going to be playing larger roles on next year's team that didn't really play all that well on Friday, and I was a bit disappointed by that. And really, all it did, at least for me, Andrew, was solidify the fact that this roster um, needed a lot of help this offseason to get to where it wants to be. And we're going to segue off of that in here in a minute, but I wanted to get your thoughts on, did you feel like that what you saw on Friday was worse than what you were expecting from some of the guys who were going to be playing next year? Or did you feel like it kind of came in as you thought it would?
Yeah, I mean, for the most part, I think that, I mean, you can go across the board, right? Like offensive line, I didn't think they were going to be very good. They weren't very good. So, I mean, that fits in pretty much exactly where I thought it would be. That's like the most discouraging piece of news overall, right? Like, if there's any position that can break the camel's back or a position group, I mean, in football, you truly are some of your parts. But, I mean, we've seen, like, Boston College had Zay Flowers, who's an all pro wide receiver. And Brent Pry beat them in year one with that roster because they didn't have an offensive line that could block anyone. That's just like, so yeah, that's pretty discouraging, right? That the guys in house right now, so you're almost relying entirely on the transfer portal in that sense, and that's not great, right? Especially because it is the hardest position to recruit in the transfer portal. Wide receivers, I mean, again, the quarterback, we'll start with quarterback, right? Quarterback, you take it with a grain of salt because of how poorly the offensive line played. Also, like, you don't know if that's necessarily going to be the quarterback that's rolling out there next year. Like, do I know whether Drones would have played better or not in the same circumstances? I don't. I figure he might. More experience,
Might have
bigger
done a little bit better in,
the run game. Yeah.
yeah, well, and not just that, but I think one of the things Pop struggled with that we saw in his first start against UVA and also in this game was the pressures up front and identifying those rushers pre-snap. This was an issue that I saw certainly in the press box on Friday.
Yeah, no, I'd agree with that. And also, just like inherently, a taller quarterback is going to have a little bit of an easier time when the offensive line is continuously coming backwards to you every play. Like you inherently get a few more seconds, if anything, which might not seem meaningful if you actually write out the amount of seconds, but it means something. And a guy with experience, like, that matters. So hard to judge the quarterback room when the highly presumed QB1 was not playing in that game. Wide receivers played all right, given the circumstances. Who did I mention in the pregame? Keelan Brody Adams. Mm-hmm. He showed out a little bit. That's encouraging. Do I feel like that warrants we should be like turning down people in the wide receiver room? I would not say so. But I don't think there's like a level of incompetence there. I understand why they're high on some of these guys, and they were high recruits, and they're guys who waited their turn. Tech had good receivers and other problems around them, so I think that's fine. Running backs did not play particularly well. They've attacked running back in the transfer portal. I can see why.
I thought, at least from my perspective, I felt like Tyler Mason at least showed some burst when he did have lanes to run through. None of those guys were overly impressive, but at least from what I felt like I saw on Friday, I felt like Mason held his own given the fact that the guys up front didn't really create much for him.
Yeah, I know, and I don't disagree with you on that. My thought process here really is looking at how a position group played in the context of the circumstances and saying, like, how comfortable would you be going in with this group next year? And at running back, especially knowing how much of Virginia Tech's success in scheming offensively has been built off a strong running game and, behind the legs of a quarterback or, no, excuse me, a running back who will go down as one of the best in Virginia Tech football history.
Yeah.
Like I think you need a little more than the guys in that room right now. And again, they're going out and trying to get those guys actively. So that's not a surprise there. And then defensively, I don't think it was a horrible showing. Again, they didn't play a complete game. Second quarter was a little bit rough, but I think there's reason to be excited about guys like Dante Lovett and the like. So defense didn't totally disappoint me. I mean, you had I mentioned Ricky that you didn't think Minnesota was this big explosive offensive machine, and I would agree with you in that sentiment, especially given that we can't act like Minnesota was playing at full strength either. But overall, clear evidence that there's work to be done. But some pieces in the younger guys that we were more openly excited about, they played pretty good games. And I think that if you wanted to walk away with any positives, like that's what you were going to be looking for. So in whatever way the game could be a success, that would be it.
For sure. Folks that are listening, we're now going to welcome all late, but fashionably late, I guess. Michael McDaniel has joined the show. Michael, first, thank you for joining us. It's glad that you were able to jump on.
Thank you. Thank you for having me. Thank you. What's the Charles Barkley line in Inside the NBA? I'm juggling a few balls here.
Jesus.
I'm here, but I'm here. What I miss? Did I miss anything?
You are.
What I miss?
Well, essentially, we've been.
I missed 17 minutes. I missed like 17 minutes. So I missed something.
Yeah. So essentially, we've just been talking about the game itself. We hadn't really branched out to the bigger picture yet. I was trying to hold that for you. So before we jump into the bigger picture stuff, Mike, any general takeaways specifically from this game that stood out to you while you were, I guess, under the influence in the stands?
Of alcohol. Be clear. Andrew, as usual, threw quite the pre-game extravaganza at his place. So shout out Andrew for the hospitality as always. Great. I had a great time in Charlotte. Had a really good time in the about the 24 hours I was there. Less than that even. 18 hours, whatever. Had a great time. So appreciate it, Andrew. Shout out to you. Game itself, I mean, went about how I expected, truthfully. Like, while I'm drinking, I'm joking in the stands about how bad we are and how bad we look, all this stuff. But, like, when you take the 30,000 foot view of, like, what this game was going to be, this went exactly how I thought, right? Like, Minnesota was playing a lot of its core guys. Virginia Tech was not. We talked about the we record on that pre-fish preview that we end up being longer than we expected last week. But we talked about how Virginia Tech was almost taking on the role of Tulane in the Military Bowl last year. And Minnesota was taking on the role of like Virginia Tech in that game where a lot of their core guys were playing. Virginia Tech didn't really have an answer for Darius Taylor. Brosmer was like not great, but Minnesota's defense held Virginia Tech in check, and it was a good Minnesota defense this year, but like I'm not sure how much of that is the answer is always somewhere in the middle, a little bit of both, but like I'm not sure how much of that was Minnesota's just playing well versus Virginia Tech's not starting anybody who's really played a college snap before on the offensive line, because that was the case, so it's hard to really like glean anything from that. Virginia Tech struggled to run it, obviously. Pop struggled to throw it. Like the protections were a total mess. Truthfully, it reminded me of the Duke game a little bit. Like Pop just like it didn't look like he had any awareness of where the rush was coming from at any time. And I think given that we saw the Virginia game and what it looks like when he's had time to prepare, I think it's pretty obvious to me that the issue was with the offensive line and not necessarily with Pop Watson. I'm sure he had some issues setting the protections at times because it's pretty much a brand new offensive line for this bowl game. But it just looked like there was like no solid communication, and the offensive line and quarterback and the running backs who were rotating in pass protection, they were just not on the same page the entire night. I mean, it was Pop takes a snap, he's running for his life. Pop takes a snap, he gets sacked. Like, it was a mess. It was a total mess on offense. Defense was fine, I thought, given who was playing. Try to look at individual performances and who stuck out. Obviously, Dante Lovett played really well. He's going to have an important role in the defense next year. Good to see him play well in this game. Good to see some of the young receivers in the fold, right, and play well and make a few plays here and there. But overall, this went pretty much entirely how I thought and kind of expected going in. I was talking to our buddy Clark Rulin before the game at Andrews, and I looked at him actually right before we started walking over to the stadium, and I said, what do you think tonight? Because like I'm not feeling great about this. I'm thinking like we lose by like 10-14 is what I was thinking. And he goes, yeah, I think 2 touchdowns. I think 2 touchdowns sounds about right. That's kind of how it went, right? Kind of how it went. So overall, hard to glean too much from it. Good to see some of the young guys play more significant snaps, but I can't walk away from this bowl game feeling like too angry. It was just like the cherry on top of a really disappointing year, and it sucks when everybody opts out. So
For sure. And, Virginia Tech does finish the year 6-7, and that was a far cry, I think, from what all of us kind of expected this year, certainly from some in the national media that had Virginia Tech penned as a potential playoff team, certainly a dark horse contender in the ACC. And it just didn't really manifest this year. Virginia Tech, the record gets worse if you include the bowl game from last year. But guys, in the post game presser, one of the things that kind of stood out was the optimistic outlook that Brent Pry had after the game, and I'm actually going to play a clip from the game, from the press conference here that I certainly want us to address. But I want to make sure we play the full clip because this certainly got a lot of run on social media, and I want to make sure that we give the full answer from Brent Pry here. So this is an unedited answer here. It's kind of a long clip. It's over a minute, but we're going to go ahead and play that now.
Again, a year ago, you guys ended with so much momentum, and then there was all that positive energy. I mean, tonight with so many guys out, obviously it's a very different scenario. What is the trajectory right now of your program?
Yeah, I'm excited about the guys returning. I'm excited about the class we signed. I'm excited about what we're doing in the transfer portal. We're a much better team even today than we were last year at this time. We're just closer in so many areas, whether it's in our locker room, whether it's on the field, whether it's depth. We're just in a better place. And I thought this bowl prep, it gave me, gave me confidence in that. Watching these young guys and what they did and how they worked and practice habits. There's a lot of good things. I think the core of our football team moving forward is guys that we signed, guys that we brought in here as freshmen. And the majority of those guys have stuck with us. And, they understand the culture. They've laid the foundation. But these seniors that played out here today, so proud and thankful for them. And you got 8 or 9 guys that hung in there with us and played in that game today. And in today's times, to me, that speaks volumes.
So there's the clip, boys. And obviously the part of that that's getting a lot of run is the fact that Pry feels like this team is in a better place than they were at the end of last season. I don't need to remind you guys how different things are for as we head into this offseason than we headed into last year's offseason. But what did you guys take from that?
Well, what I'll say is this, right? The podcast that we're recording right now and the conversation that we're having right now is on a different planet than the one we had, a little more than 365 days ago after the Military Bowl. Like, there's no one's questioning that. That felt like a launching point to the return of Virginia Tech football, and this feels like a boat is being pushed off into a sea of uncertainty. Like, let's not say that this season was a success. Like, I'm sure you could go back onto our pregame podcast where we mapped this out as the potential worst possible case scenario. I don't think any of us thought this team could do any worse than 6-6, and that's exactly what they did. They went just at that level of the bare minimum of what we expected that they could do. A massive failure on that level. That being said, like, if you put a lie detector test on the guy, like, I'm sure he probably somewhat agrees. Like, this team brought back the most starters in the country last year from a team that seemed to be gaining momentum, and they get a 6-6 season. Like, there's no way that you feel better positioned today than you did then.
You have to feel worse.
Yeah. You have
Play
to
the
feel
hits,
worse.
Mike.
You have to feel worse. Good plug. But I mean, he's not going to go out and say that though. Like, he's not going to tell the truth. It's a press conference. He's the CEO of an organization where every single one of his effective employees are free agents that could leave at any moment. What, are you going to go out and say anything negative about the program?
Yeah.
That would be the time that you would least want to say anything negative about the program. You're not only trying to retain what you have, which, like, does it blow my mind that, like, when you hear I'm returning messages from Dante Lovett and Caleb Woodson, in my mind, I'm like, of course you're returning. You haven't even done anything yet. Like, but
I'm back. I'm
yeah,
back.
like, perfect. Great. We didn't realize that was in question, but it's just the nature of the beast. It's the nature of the beast. So he's concurrently trying to retain the talent that he has on the roster. These guys that we look at this Mayo Bowl and say, well, the game is what we thought it was, but at least X, Y, and Z showed up a little bit. That gives you some hope. Yeah, X, Y, and Z could leave at any time. So you want to keep them. And then, just as if not more importantly, what I'm sure Brent Pry is doing today and yesterday, and probably getting on the phone after the game and doing there too, trying to sell this thing to the guys that can come in and fill those gaps that we also saw were glaringly clear in that football game, and try to put together a competitive football team. So, yeah, it's coach speak. I don't blame the guy for saying it. Again, it's his job to do that. He is a salesman at his core. That's part of his job. And he's going to continue to sell this until there's nothing, for him at least, left to sell. So, it was all a bunch of coach speak mumbo jumbo. But yeah, at the end of the day, living in reality, you have to feel worse.
The I'm back tweets, like, that are just embroidered and triumph marketing from Caleb Woodson and Dante Lovett, who, like, have played Jaden Keller. Like, be so serious, for the love of God. Like, especially in Lovett's case, like, Lovett played significant snaps this year, but he was a third corner. Like, Woodson played a lot, obviously. Jaden Keller played a lot, obviously. But they're announcing they're back, like Tim Tebow, after he won the national championship, and he's, like, at the parade announcing he's coming back for his senior year. They're, like, making it out to be, like, that sort of thing. I'm like, you guys are, like, second stringers and, like, have been throughout your entirety at Virginia Tech, like, mid to slightly above average players when you're at your best. Like, be so serious with this, okay? I get it. It's the era we're in. I'm glad they're back. Like, Lovett being back, I think, is really impactful. Woodson being back is really impactful. Jaden Keller, we know it's been a roller coaster ride, but he had a lot of good moments this year. You'd rather have him on the team next year than not, but that's just a little soapbox thing. Separately, I believe Pry in that I think that he does feel a lot better about the depth on the team now and the guys that he's recruited and the young guys that he's brought in. I believe him when he says that he thinks the program's in a good spot from that standpoint than this time last year. I believe him. I believe him obviously from the standpoint of I think that recruiting and the talent that he's brought in at the high school level is in a much better place than when he took over. With that said, you went 6-7. Even if you went 7-6, we mentioned this at length since the end of the regular season. Even if you went 7-6, this wasn't going to be a situation where we felt any different coming out of the bowl game about the season and how it went. The bowl game, from that standpoint, was kind of meaningless going into it, unfortunately. It's coach speak. It's absolutely coach speak. But I think there is a little bit of truth in what he's saying, in that I think he does believe in the depth and the young guys. And to his credit, a lot of the young guys who have gotten on the field when veterans have gotten hurt, or maybe they've just outplayed them, the young guys have played pretty well, right? So that's like the sliver of hope when they've played significant snaps in the regular season. They looked pretty good. Now, what does that look like with larger sample size? We'll see. What does it look like with the new assistants on staff? We'll see what the roles look like, that sort of thing. But this season was a disappointment. And my takeaway is that he can say he feels better about the direction of the program and kind of where the team is all he wants, but until we actually see the product improving on the field, it's all talk, right? And the majority of his tenure has been all talk so far, right? I mean, this has been, it was a really bad year one. Year two was looking bad through the first 5 weeks, and it improved, but Tech still didn't really beat a good team. You went through this schedule this year, and you still haven't really beaten a good team. We're still waiting for the signature win at the tenure going into year four. And the first season you had expectations, you had a bunch of veteran guys returning. I get Kyron Drones is banged up, but for the offensive line to look as bad as it did this year was just unacceptable. And that's why Virginia Tech has a new offensive line coach, right? And, Virginia Tech's defense, when it was good, it was good. And when it wasn't, it wasn't. And that's why Marv's gone. Strength and conditioning. From the outside, it's tough to tell. You can make the assessment, oh, yeah, the guys look like they're getting tired, but really, that's internal. The coaching staff knows if this is a strength and conditioning thing versus a game flow thing. They made the determination that Dwight Galt wasn't getting the job done, so they moved on from him. So it's a big we'll see for me going into year four, right? Obviously, a big we'll see. And it's hard to feel really good going into next year, but I do like the transfers they've brought. They're still bringing transfers in, and I like the guys they're adding. And I do like the young players that are going to be back. So, I think there's a good foundation, but whether or not Pry and his staff get the most out of those players remains to be seen, because it has not been the case through the first 3 years so far. It just has not been the case.
Absolutely. And I think for me that the biggest issue I had with this quote, because originally I thought he was referring to kind of the program more holistically, whether it be their fundraising, their recruiting footprint, their brand.
Yeah.
I kind of, when I'm, we were actually talking about this, all the reporters after the press conference. And that was kind of my interpretation of it. And then I went back and actually listened to the whole clip. And I think you guys are absolutely right. Andrew nailed it on the head. This is coach speak, but I do feel like my intelligence is being insulted here a little bit when you say we're a much better team even today than we were last year at this time. I mean, there's
just no way.
there's
I mean,
no
there's no way.
objective standard that you could point to that would say absolutely Virginia Tech is a better team. Now you can make the argument that, well, the young guys that we've recruited are better than the young guys we were relying on last year, and therefore I'm more confident in the depth. You can try and make that argument. I'm not
Prove it.
necessarily going to buy it, but you
You gotta
can try
prove
and
it.
make it.
Right.
But for me, while I agree, Andrew, that his hands are tied a little bit, right? He's entering year 4. All of what he's done, as you've kind of mentioned, is be a salesman for this program. And I'll give him credit. He's been very good at it. Brent has done, I think, a phenomenal job of constantly being able to keep the positive momentum or the positive outlook going when it comes to the outside looking in. He's done that much better than the previous regime did, without question. But just following such a season where Virginia Tech struggled so much and fell so short, not just of our expectations, but their own expectations, to then come out after a 2-touchdown loss to a mediocre Big Ten team in Minnesota that, I mean, it is important to acknowledge they were missing multiple starters on both sides of the ball as well, to then try and say we're a better team than we were after last season. I mean, I certainly hope that they're going to be a better team than they were this year, but it's not landing with me. And as someone that's covered the program both full time and part time for on and off essentially for the last almost 10 years now, actually longer than 10 years, it's rather insulting to my intelligence to be like, yeah, this team's actually better off. Like you thought the vibes were great last year when we smoked Tulane in the Military Bowl in the frigid monsoon in Annapolis. No, it's way better right now, and I just can't buy it.
Yeah, I mean, you're 100% right. To which I say, I don't think he's worried about insulting any of our intelligence.
No,
he's literally
he's
just
not.
trying to recruit
He doesn't
players
care.
to the team so the team can be competitive for next year. But you mentioned, they fell short of their own expectations, and this would be like the real barometer, right? You look back 2 seasons, and they were dropping articles, or the Andrea Adelson article, which was in the eyes of many conspiracy theorists.
Not always there. She's not always there when you call, but she's always on time, baby. Right before a season starts, you're going to get a.
But to
Andrea
that
Adelson
point, the
banger.
conspiracy theory there was this like leaked information from internally to temper expectations after a bad season, saying, look how bad the situation we were left in was. Very different vibe than ACC Media Day this year. Brent Pry, and I'm paraphrasing, but I think almost to a T. Yeah, like anything, like the ACC championship is our goal. Anything short of that is a failure. And they fell quite short. So if you believe the program's in a better position today than you did a year ago, are you going to go out and say the same thing next year? Because, in your heart of hearts, there's just no way you can believe that. But for all the reasons I mentioned at the outset, it's not surprising that he would say stuff like that. I'm sure he's as disappointed as anyone, given that, again, like when at the end of the day, like the Virginia Tech team that went out at the Mayo Bowl wasn't Virginia Tech from this year. And had Virginia Tech gone 9-3, the transfer portal and going pro situation could have gone the exact same, and the bowl game could have looked the exact same. It could have been the Mayo Bowl too. But
this conversation would have been a lot different, right? Like that's the thing.
Yeah. And as we said before the season, you have everything lined up in this way with, 6 players going to the combine. Now it's not like a crazy number. It's not LSU, but you had some NFL level talent on your team in playing in the ACC, and you didn't manage much. And the fact that you were in those games is more of an indictment on how much of a failure it was, because you had the talent to succeed, and ultimately in an industry where you are judged on wins and losses, you lost too many of those games. And even if you just go back, even if you go 3-3 in those one-score games, such a different season, such a different vibe. But it went about as bad as it could have in those circumstances. And it happened in a season where you had everything lined up, and we knew that you were going to be losing a ton of talent in the season that followed. So rather than having maybe a little bit of leeway in that situation, now the pressure's on. And now he has to go out and say things and recruit like a madman in the transfer portal. And, I'm sure we can do a different episode maybe in a week once a couple more dominoes fall, going name by name. But
Yeah.
I'll give you a little bit of a sneak preview. It's they're going out, they're grabbing talent, they're throwing it at the wall, and they hope some sticks, right? Just creating depth with players who have played at the FBS level before. Some of them at the FBS level. And hoping that you can, by late August, when you have to start things off at a neutral site nationally televised game against South Carolina and the team who was coached by the legend's son, that you could put together a competitive football team. And that's the task ahead of him in a year where now there's a lot of pressure. I mean, I've already started seeing national articles about the hot seat going into 2025 with Coach Pry's name on it. And it's amazing how quickly the tides can shift in this sport.
Well, fortunately for Brent, not everybody judges wins and losses. Certainly Kirk Herbstreit's probably okay with not so many wins, depending on who they're against.
Thank you for that. I don't. I think Virginia Tech fans would like to think that Brent Pry's seat is really hot. I just don't think it is.
I mean,
I don't think it is.
Well,
I think it would have to be really, really bad. Like, Babcock's not firing him.
Well, see, that's the thing. We've had this discussion, right, about the only way that Brent Pry isn't coaching at Virginia Tech is if his boss gets fired first.
Yeah.
And
which
could happen.
I believe when I see it.
I mean, I'm not gonna say it's not going to happen after next season. I think that there is maybe I'm being naive, but I'm going to put a little bit of faith in Tim Sands, that he's got his fingers on the pulse of this. And based on an interview that he gave several weeks ago that we referenced here on this podcast, it seems like he at least publicly understands the importance of having a competitive football program. And if Virginia Tech were to go out there next year and finish 5-7, which is extremely reasonable based on what we know about this roster right now, I think that that's going to spark some conversations over in Burris Hall about whether or not there needs to be a leadership change in Merriman. And Mike, I understand your hesitance to kind of buy that based on kind of Sands as a person and how he's kind of handled athletics throughout his tenure in Blacksburg.
Yeah.
But I do think that there is a certain point where Sands is going to come to a conclusion that he simply can't let this go any further. I mean, if you look at the last 2 seasons and what has happened to his top 3 sports, they've all gone down. I mean, the football program is floundering in mediocrity. The men's basketball program is in the middle of bottoming out for the first time since James Johnson. Megan Duffy is doing her hardest to try and keep the women's basketball team afloat. They seem to be okay, but they're certainly nowhere near where they were a couple years ago, both in terms of talent and resources. So you have your top three athletic programs, of which are making you some revenue, and all three of them are struggling. And guys, I don't know if you've seen some of the crowds at the games in Castle this season. They're pretty bad. Folks are not interested in going, and eventually those numbers are going to show up on some P&Ls, and you can only get away with that for so long. I don't know when that point is, but depending on how things go in 2025, we may get to that point in late November, early December.
I'm not going to say it's not going to happen, but I'll believe it when I see it. But in regard to Witt, we'll see. The Pry thing, I mean, if this team's around 500 next year, I don't think he's going anywhere. Like, I think this would have to be 3-9 or 4-8 or something. I just don't. I mean, I don't see it. Witt's not going to fire. Like, there's no impetus for Witt to fire him. He's not going to. Now, I think if Pry goes 3-9 or 4-8, like, Sands is going to fire Witt Babcock. Like, he's going to fire him. Like, it's clear that, because at that point it would be clear that he's whiffed on a second consecutive coaching hire. He's going to hire a new AD, and at that point, like, you're in a spot with college athletics right now. We're moving into a revenue sharing era. You don't want to pay a coach to not coach, right? You don't want to pay the buyout. You want to use that money and pay for your roster. It would have to be really, really bad. Like, I'm telling you, like, programs do not want to pay buyouts right now. They don't want to do it. They just don't know. There's this, like, rev share model, and there's this, like, salary cap for the sports, and a lot of it's going to football, obviously, at most places in the Power Four conferences. All the money's going to roster retention for football for the places that aren't Kentucky, Duke. But you, like, look at even Duke, right? I mean, they just paid. They're paying Mensa like $4 million a year. Like, football drives everything, man. It drives everything. So, like, even at the basketball schools, it's all about football. In this era, because there's just so much money in it. There's so much money in football now. You have to be serious about it. If you're a Power Four program, you have to be. Even if you've historically been a basketball school. North Carolina just hired Bill Belichick. Like, that's not because they're trying to win. I know that, like, outward facing, they're like, oh yeah, we want to win a national championship. Internally, like, you're hiring Bill Belichick because you want to raise the profile of the program. He's going on Pat McAfee every week. They're raising all sorts of money for him. Like, that's what it's about. It's about elevating the profile of the program from a fundraising standpoint to a point where you've never been before in a brand new revenue sharing era of college athletics. That's what this whole thing's about. So, you know, Sands has some decisions to make with Witt. He's not going to really be pressured to make them unless football bottoms out again next year. If Virginia Tech's around 500, I don't think anybody's going anywhere. We'll see. I'll believe it when I see it. I'm not going to say no, like Sands won't do it, but it would be breaking character for Sands to actually move on from Witt Babcock. It would be something that he has never done before. I'm not saying he won't, and he's made comments indicating that he wants the football program to be serious. But much like we've just said with Brent Pry and him talking about how he feels like the program's in a better place and all this stuff, I will believe it when I see it. Like, there's no reason for me to feel really good about the direction of anything right now until I see palpable results, because we just have not seen them in a really long time with football specifically. So it's just really hard to get a gauge. The high point the last 5 years was October and November of last year when Virginia Tech was beating 500 teams. That's the high point of the program the last 5 years.
Yeah.
So it's like, it's hard for me to get really, like, jazzed up and thinking that, you know, this thing's going to get turned around for Pry, or if it doesn't, that Sands is going to fire Witt. I feel like it's got to get pretty bad. Maybe I'm wrong, but I feel like it's got to get pretty bad.
So important to note, because you mentioned you don't want to be paying 2 football coaches. Brent Pry has 3 seasons left on his deal, if you include next year. So 2025, he's slated to make 4.75 million, and then 26 and 27 slated to make 5 million. So if for some reason he were to be let go after the year, you're going to have 2 years remaining of his contract plus whatever contracts you may have signed with your coordinators and assistants, depending on what's left of those deals.
Yeah. Yep. And hey, every year that goes by, the buyout goes down. So as long as I
think I read somewhere it's about 70% of whatever money is left on the contract to be paid.
And here's the way I look at it, right? Just real fast. Arizona State was in a horrible, horrible spot when Kenny Dillingham was hired, right? I mean, sanctions from the Herm Edwards regime, from recruiting violations during COVID and all that stuff. Like, they were in a really, really bad spot. Like, roster issues abound. Some of it from the recruiting violations. They were in just a really tough spot. Dillingham takes over and turns the program around. I don't think anybody was expecting him to win 11 games this year and win the Big 12. In fact, a lot of people had Arizona State as one of the worst teams in the Big 12 on paper heading into the year, and he turned it around. Like, this doesn't have to be Virginia Tech being around 500. I know the fan base hates it, and a lot of people take a lot of pride in when Virginia Tech was really good under Beamer, and they should. But in terms of firing a coach, paying an exorbitant buyout, having this team be 500 and be competitive sometimes is going to be, and fans are going to hate hearing this, but it's going to be a determining factor in whether or not they keep or fire this guy, period. Just because of the era we're in, and schools don't want to pay the buyouts. And they're going to feel like, hey, if he's going 500 every year, eventually we're going to let him go. But the buyout keeps going down, and we can bring in a new coach, and recruiting relationships in Virginia will be somewhat repaired, and Virginia Tech as a school will be in a better spot in a talent-rich state in Virginia. And we can now pull the trigger when the buyout's a little bit lower, and we have a better grasp of what the revenue-sharing era and what roster pay for play is going to look like. Because right now, a lot of programs think they know what it's going to look like, but until the bullets start flying, you don't know. And that's why I think if Pry's around 500, I think it's going to be really, really hard for, obviously, Witt, but Sands to put pressure on Witt to pull the trigger on Pry and fire him next year. I think he's around until at least 26. That's my personal opinion, just with the state of the sport and everything else. But it would have to get real bad next year, I think.
Yeah, and the whole other interesting part of this, right, is the additional money that Virginia Tech has put into the coaching pools in general. I mean, not just the paying your head coach almost $5 million a year, but when Pry was hired, the assistant pool was like second or third in the ACC in terms of size, and he was paying multi-million dollars to his support staff. And Virginia Tech has pulled so much money for NIL out of other sports to put into football. You have such a large investment that you're putting into something that isn't really generating the return that you're expecting it to generate. And I think a question that Sands is probably going to ask is, what is it going to take to get the return that we're supposed to be getting out of this?
Yeah.
I mean, I'm speculating here entirely, but from a percentage basis, I feel like Virginia Tech is putting more than the average into their football program than comparable schools. It seems like Virginia Tech is willing to sacrifice NIL opportunities and funds for other teams to try and level that playing field a little bit on the football side. And I'm not sure Sands is going to go for that much longer if the results are the same. And I keep bringing up the president because this is ultimately going to fall on his desk. He's going to have to make this call because, as we've said numerous times, Whit Babcock has no incentive to fire Brent Pry. He knows that his career in Blacksburg is essentially stitched at the hip to what Brent Pry does at Virginia Tech.
Witt could also just, I mean, we haven't talked about this angle yet. Witt can also just retire. Like, he could just say, well, I'm good. I'm good. He's made plenty of money. He'd just be like, you know what? I don't need the headache. I don't need to wait it out. He could just retire.
Yeah.
I suspect that when it does happen, whether that's in 2025, 2026, or what have you, it will be called retirement. Mm-hmm. It's a little bit of a forced retirement.
Well, so let me put it to you guys this way. Yes or no question. Will Brent Pry sign an extension at Virginia Tech at some point? Which essentially the question is this going to work out? Yes or no?
I mean, I have no reason to believe it will now. I mean, what have we seen? No. I think the answer is no. I'm not ridiculing your question, Rick. It's more of like an open-ended, like, what have we seen, you know? Like,
yeah, no,
it's a fair question.
Yeah, essentially I'm asking, I mean, he's got 2 years left on the deal, so that there's, 3 years if we include next year. So he's stuck here for a little bit unless you want to pay him the money to go away. So all I was trying to get at was, do we see any realistic scenario in which we're out over our skis, Pry figures this out, and he's able to secure an extension and things get better?
And counting 3 seasons, but before Andrew answers, like counting next season, like 3 seasons left, it's really 2. It's 25 and 26 because you're going to make the move one way or another, either extending him or cutting him after 26, because you're not going to have him go out and recruit on a lame duck contract in the final year. Like, kids are going to want clarity, especially if kids are starting to sign contracts where they're committing to a school for 2 years. Because that's I don't know when that's coming, but I think that's coming at some point in the next half decade. If that's like the case sooner rather than later, they're going to want clarity on who the head coach is, right? And he's not going to be. Coaches are generally fired before the final year of their contract, right? Or they're extended, one of the two. So I think it's really like a 2-year window here.
Yeah, like, do I see a scenario where it could happen? Yeah. Based on the evidence that we have, would I bet money on that? No. I mean, it's like, for all the reasons you guys mentioned previously, and as we mentioned all season, and like, you want the guy to succeed really badly, but he was in a position to not only elevate the program, but buy himself a little bit of leeway in a sport where perception is reality. It's hard to imagine, us getting back to the point where we were with him and his staff just 365 days ago. People got mad at me for saying, like, oh, Pry might leave after this season. Like, talk about a bad take and a half.
But, man.
We were all drinking the Kool-Aid, but the Kool-Aid's going to be a Kool-Aid of skepticism. At least it should be.
It's not going to be a sweet this offseason.
Listen. I can guarantee, some people will call us negative, right? I can guarantee that the 3 of us on this podcast, you guys come. Listen, we have content all off season, but if you're just coming around during football season, that's fine. If you want to join back in July, August, whatever, I prefer that you stay around longer than that. But if you're coming around like July, August, getting ready for a new season, and you're hearing another podcast talking about 8, 9, if there are any podcasts out there talking 8, 9, 10 wins, shut them off and come listen to this one. And that's no disrespect to any of the other podcasts out there. No disrespect. But how can you logically, even with the transfers, which I like, even with the young guys, which I like, after what you just watched this year with a senior-laden roster, how can you seriously look people in the face and say that next year is anything but a wait and see? You're lying to your audience. That's all I'm going to say. Like, this is going to be a very much a wait. I'm not saying Virginia Tech can't go out and do that. I'm not saying that. If you're not approaching next year with a wait and see approach, I think you're probably setting yourself up for a little bit of failure. Or you're going to be right, and that'll be fantastic, and the program will be in a much better place. But given the expectations this year, the roster Virginia Tech had, and how on paper it still looks better than the roster Virginia Tech is going to have in 25, even with the transfers, even with better y'all than me. Hypothetically, of course. Hypothetically. Yeah.
We said at the beginning of the year that this was Brent Pry's best shot at a big season. He had the returning quarterback. He had the star running back. He had a returning offensive line. He had a bunch of returning receivers. He had guys on defense that were going to get looks at the NFL level. It was going to be really difficult for Pry to replicate the kind of roster that he had for this season that we just finished in the future, especially within the next 1 to 2 years. So this was really Brent's chance to buy him some time and to really buy him some slack for the rebuilding that now has to happen. I mean, if you look at this roster, just look at the guys that all the holes that were on the field on Friday night in Charlotte. Brent has to fill those holes now. And the guys that are filling those holes, he has to fill those spots on the depth chart behind them. So this is a team that really is requiring almost not a complete overhaul, but damn near close on both sides of the ball. And usually when that happens, you don't win a lot of football games. And if Brent had won 8, maybe even 9 games in 2024, you would have been able to go into 2025 and say, hey, look, when the roster's right, we can win 8+ games.
Yep.
So give me another year or two. I'll get the roster right. We'll come back in 26 or something. We'll be more experienced. We'll have more veteran players, and we're going to make another run at this. But when you take an experienced roster that's got the returning quarterback, the star running back, all these guys that are now, like Andrew mentioned, going to the combine, and you win 6 games and you go 6-7, I mean, that doesn't bode well for the period to come when you're trying to fill all those gaps.
It's going to be hard to evaluate now, too, guys. Like, because this was such an underachievement that if Virginia Tech goes 6-6 next year, I think that would have been looked at if it was a good year 3. I think a 6-6 year 4, given everything that Virginia Tech was going to lose in that scenario, I think 6-6 in year 4, 7-5 would have been pretty reasonable, young roster, etc. But now, if you do that again, it's like, are we overachieving with a young roster? Are we running in place? We just did exactly what we did the year before, roughly, in the regular season. Like, it's going to start to be hard to evaluate, which is why I think he stays in that, right? You know what I mean? That's kind of part of the reason why I think if he's around 500, he stays, because it's going to be kind of difficult. This year went so not according to plan.
Yeah.
That it's going to become hard.
I mean, it just is what it is. Like, we're literally talking about the same record last year in the regular season as this year. And the conversation is so different. And that's also the same record that got Justin Fuente fired. And those were his worst records.
Yeah.
He had a number of high achieving seasons to fall back on. So, everything needs to be taken within the context of the situation. But, like, now the overarching context of the situation is that the guy hasn't done any better than the record that got his predecessor fired. So like his back's kind of against the wall because he's losing a lot of talent. But he didn't do that well with the talent that he had. It is what it is. But yeah, I mean, it's certainly not an enviable position for him, for anyone on that staff, but it's the situation they find themselves in. And, you're just going to have to, again, we're already an hour and 5 minutes in. We could do a full, once this portal window closes, evaluation of how we think they did and how we feel like it might fill in those gaps. But yeah, I mean, just throw shit at the wall, hope it sticks. That's all you can do at this point, right?
Yeah.
In this era of college football, in this predicament that they find themselves in, you had a unique scenario where you had a roster full of promise. Pretty much everyone came back, and you added to it with, I don't see an Aeneas Peebles having come in yet through the transfer portal. No one with that kind of resume.
Yeah.
And you couldn't improve upon that record. It's tough. It's tough.
So I'm a glutton for punishment, boys, and I went and looked at the opponents for next year. First 2 weeks, South Carolina in Atlanta, and then Vanderbilt at home. If Brent goes 0-2 to start the year next year, I think we're going to have many a take from folks across the national landscape regarding his future in Blacksburg. Otherwise, guys, if you look at this schedule, and I feel like we say this every year in the ACC, it's gettable. Like, the schedule's not looking to be all that difficult. You've got Florida State, which I guess who the hell knows what they're going to look like next year. The toughest road game, that's a true road game, is maybe Georgia Tech, depending on what that roster looks like. You get Cal, Louisville, Wake Forest at home. You get Miami without Cam Ward at home. You've got to go to Raleigh to face NC State. So that schedule is not exactly daunting. But again, going back to this year, the schedule wasn't daunting either. Virginia Tech had much more experience across the board on both sides of the ball and couldn't take advantage of it. Unfortunately, that may end up what happens next season.
I mean, Tech will probably be an underdog in those first 2 games. I mean, they're definitely going to be an underdog, I think, given what South Carolina's bringing back. They'll definitely be an underdog there. Vanderbilt
Probably a double-digit underdog, I would bet.
Yeah, probably so. Vanderbilt, Poppy is back. They're losing a lot, but Poppy is back. So, I mean, that's more of a toss-up. But, yeah, I mean, they'll be for sure an underdog in South Carolina, like a substantial underdog.
That South Carolina spread might be like 14.5. Like, I feel like it's going to be a big spread.
Yeah.
But, boys, we've done this for, Andrew and I have done this for over an hour. Mike, you haven't.
About 50 or so minutes. Yeah.
Anything else about the Dukes Mayo Bowl? I want to give a shout out to the folks at Charlotte Sports for the Dukes Mayo Bowl in general. They are like the closest thing that I saw outside of maybe the Cheez-It Bowl to taking bowl season for what it's supposed to be. Like, obviously, Pop-Tarts does a phenomenal job with the Pop-Tarts Bowl, and that's exactly what all bowl sponsors should be doing. But I do want to give a shout out to Dukes Mayo for putting up a good effort in Charlotte and trying to make it a fun experience for not just the players and the fans, but also Flava Flav, apparently, who was running around the sidelines.
Yeah, shout out, the Charlotte Sports Foundation. I mean, they do a good job. Shout out to the Hokie Nation for continuing to show up, even for
Another
what was
good show out.
A meaningless game that everyone kind of expected us to lose.
Also, shout out to the Minnesota fans jumping during Enter Sandman. I was pretty cool.
Minnesota is kind of in a Virginia Tech situation where they feel like they're bringing a lot back and they're building off of something going into next year. But just as our win against Tulane was
Not
against
with Max Brosmer, they're not. Jesus, I don't know what they see.
I think they're actively working on that.
That would be advisable.
But yeah, shout out to Jimmy Cleveland for winning the contest. Shout out to everyone who came to the pregame. Producer Scott, my guy, Clark Rowland, Izzy Post. Shout out to Izzy for all of her photos on the sideline all season. Great addition. Gives us that added element there. Shout out to Clark, who gave me the commemorative Frank Beamer statue that they gave away years ago, which I've actually been looking for one of those for a long time. And for bringing the Krispy Kreme donuts to the pregame, because you know what?
The hats. We got a picture with Krispy Kreme hats while we were there.
You have a picture with Krispy Kreme hats. It's just a lot of tremendous stuff going all around. Yeah, just shout out to the fans. Shout out to all of our listeners, obviously, hanging in there with us all season long. It wasn't necessarily the pretty season that we predicted as we reviewed for the last hour and 10 minutes, but certainly one worth analyzing over the course of time. And if you choose us, we appreciate that. And, thanks for giving us a reason to jump on the mic here at 10:45 p.m. on a regular basis and get together and have a lot of fun doing it. So year 6 of doing this in the books, gentlemen. It's been an interesting 6 years, and let's keep it going for as long as we can.
Yes, it has.
Team still sucks. The whoever supplied the Rumplements at Andrews, shout out to them. I died pretty much. Thank you. Shout out to Charlotte Beer Garden. What an establishment. What a fine establishment.
Great folks over at Charlotte Beer Garden. I've given them plenty of free podcast advertising. They have no idea. But in my heart, I know people go to Charlotte Beer Garden because they hear about it on the media that I put out into the world. And I had to give Mike and Scott that experience, and they did a good job. From what I could tell, they did a good job of keeping Mike McDaniel entertained.
Yeah. There was a point later in the proceedings, well after the game ended at Charlotte Beer Garden, where I turned to Scott and said, maybe we should switch to water. And he said, yeah, I agree. And he went to the bar, and he came back with 2 IPAs. And at that moment, I knew it was time to get an Uber and get the hell out of there. So that's exactly what we did.
Oh, man. That sounds
I did have some people saying, like, where'd Mike McDaniel and his brother-in-law go? And I was like, oh, they left. So they just drove 5 hours to go to that game and then leave the next morning. I said, "Yep, it was a it was a quick, well executed mission from the moment you guys got there."
The things that we do for this football program, gentlemen.
No
Damn
kidding.
straight.
The things that we do. All right, like Andrew said, we'll be back relatively soon for an episode to talk more about these transfers. Tech added like 3 or 4 guys since we recorded last, all of which are intriguing to say the least. So we'll at least address that. Who knows? Maybe we'll get some defensive coordinator news here in the next week potentially.
I wouldn't expect that until at least April.
Jesus. All right. Rate, review, subscribe. Shout out to Counts Family Pharmacy. Shout out to Home Field Apparel. We're wearing the Home Field t-shirt right now. Again, if you're listening, thank you. We appreciate it. Sorry we could not go live for this episode. I know that a lot of folks really enjoyed that feature for this year. Don't worry, it's not going anywhere. We will be recording live more down the road. Also, maybe working on some other stuff for you for next year. So be patient with us. Thanks for listening. Until the next episode, go Hokies.